Hello to anyone who is watching this recording after the fact. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for following along with this conversation about the Gospel of Matthew. And we will open with prayer. Let us pray. Grant us, Lord, not to be anxious about earthly things, but to love things heavenly. And even now, while we are placed among things that are passing away, to hold fast to those that shall endure. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Amen. And just a reminder that All Saints Day proper is next Wednesday, November 1st. I'm having a hard time believing that October is just about over. It seems like it's
It's
been a
amazing.
month.
We're talking about Thanksgiving.
Exactly. So there will not be Bible study next week. I'm going over to Wes to participate in their the Eucharistic chapel earlier in the morning. And then I will offer just a simple spoken Eucharist in honor of All Saints at noon here at the church. And then if anybody is around for that and would like, we can go grab some lunch together. And if no one can do that, that's absolutely fine. It's just we had talked about finding some times to be in person together. So I thought that might lend itself. So just I'll remind everybody that we're doing that service is next Wednesday. And today, once again, I'm amazed that our Bible study conversation is tracking with the Sunday lectionary. When we started this 40 weeks ago, I keep track which week we're on. So this is discussion week number 40. When we started Matthew 40 weeks ago, I could not possibly have planned that it would coincide like this. So that's a Holy Spirit thing. So we'll be talking today about the coin that we heard about on this past Sunday, and then hopefully we can move forward in Matthew 22. But and I'll come back to these images, but before we do that, I'm wondering if there are any lingering thoughts about the parable of the wedding banquet. I saw that there was some email conversation and some articles and some thoughts going back and forth last week. I didn't jump into the fray because I figured you didn't need me doing that. I did send out a sermon that was recommended by Sue Carroll, Ray's wife. And I sent that out this morning to you all. It is Natalie Boltz-Weber and her take on this parable. But I'm just wondering, is there anything else lingering that needs to be said before we push forward?
All I can say is I don't understand. I can't believe that the parable would have all those parts to it, all those moving parts, and to make just one comment at the end.
Exactly. I would say it is probably one of the more complicated parables. And I will also say it's one of the parables I understand the least.
Thank you, Patty. That puts my mind at rest.
Every time I read it, I come away thinking, okay, here's another take on it. I was like, oh, and as the conversation went back and forth via email last week, I thought, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, if you haven't had a chance to look at the Nadia Boltz-Weber sermon, I commend it to you. She just has a way of cutting straight to the chase that I find very helpful. All right, so now we are going to read the gospel passage that was appointed for this past Sunday, the question about paying taxes. Would someone like to read it for us?
Sure.
Thanks, Fred.
Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? "Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away.
There's that theme of amazement again. And we've picked up on this reading through Matthew, right? Over and over and over again, people are amazed or in awe, perplexed, stupefied by something that Jesus has said or done or taught. And here, here we go again. Any thoughts about this parable? Any words that strike you? Any questions, ideas?
Unlike, I think you mentioned Sunday that, they had the denarius on them. The text is clear that, they might have not have had one. They had one brought to him. So the Pharisees might have been keeping themselves pure in that regard.
Somebody had it though, right?
Yeah.
It's
They
they
might have an
brought one.
attendant, or they might have they might have sent out for one.
Mhm. Door dashed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Yeah, so that's what I thought. The Greek here can mean to bring, or it can just mean hand a thing over. So fair enough. It's not immediately clear. Although a lot of biblical scholars seem to think that they had it right on them. But
They
okay.
might have had it, close by, but they also might have, had a non-Jewish attendant who was, walking along carrying the purse.
Yeah. Although that might be a little eisegesis because that's not in the text, but we can imagine that that's a possibility. What else do you hear or wonder about this encounter? So again, where does this take place?
Jerusalem, in the
Where?
temple.
The temple.
Temple.
Yep.
Assuming the money changers had set their stalls back up, it would have been very easy to find a denarius in there.
Exactly. Exactly. Hopefully they got the message. What else? Somebody else? Any thoughts, questions?
I really, I really think it's such a satisfying one, especially coming after the previous
I
one.
was gonna say.
I mean, it's the Jesus that I anyway just want to hear that that he's just putting them right down, just cutting them off at the knees, and makes a lot of sense, and it just seems to be sensible homespun advice that sort of like, these affairs of the state have nothing to do with God, and so get a clue, Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
I have to wonder if this question had not appeared often before.
Hmm.
I mean, you have the money changers who were saying, who are changing because you're not allowed to carry, Roman icons or, things like that. I mean, it's hard for me to think that this question of, is it legal to pay the tax, and with all the Jews in Jerusalem, had not arisen before and been thoroughly discussed.
Mm-hmm. And it may have been among the rabbis, but this may have been the first time that it was asked of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that this image is so helpful when we think about whose image is on the coin. I mean, there it is, as clear as can be. So how cool that we have that extent that we
I don't
can.
know. That looks looking more like a woman's image to me.
Do you remember what some of the emperors look like? Wow. Yeah.
The verse 22, it keeps making me think back or forward. I don't know exactly where it is. Isn't this the son of the carpenter from Nazareth? And
Ah,
where does he get this knowledge
yeah,
from? That's what keeps on coming to my mind.
that's great, Elin, because yeah, I mean, and again, talking about the rabbis, right? That I mean, Jesus is brilliant. Some of the parables he tells, the preceding one, maybe notwithstanding, because we don't like that one. So often the way he knits together a story and then the way he handles these theological challenges. I mean, it's unbelievable. And so, yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Elin. Where does he get this stuff, right? Who is this guy? We think we know him, and then he does something like this. Yeah.
The only thing that for me, he definitely puts the Pharisees in their place on this, and it's a quick because I think Donna said, it's a quick way to
Down.
cut them off at the knees. But then the question becomes, what if Caesar is not doing God's work? What if Caesar is a bad person?
Hmm.
That would have been the logical follow-up question.
Hmm.
They were cut off so bad that they were dumbfounded, and that would have been the follow-up question.
Yeah.
There's no doubt the Jews regarded Caesar as a bad person.
I would say so.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
they were
let's
God's chosen people, and they were getting kicked around by this, by this jerk.
yeah. So let's go there. Let's ask that. Let's play around with that question. So what's the implication? Caesar is a bad dude, at least to the Jews. What do you think? What's Jesus getting at?
I think he's saying you have to take stock in your life. Everybody does, and you have to figure out, am I doing what God wants me to do, or am I all is all my business all part and parcel of the affairs of the world that are just very self-serving for the affairs of the world, and to kind of take stock of your life and what's important, what's not.
Kingdom of heaven has nothing to do with the kingdoms on earth.
That's right. I think this is like one of the first separation of church and state, and God's law is not man's law. They're two different things.
So why does Jesus say, render to Caesar, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's? Why, given the question that Chuck raised, and I think it's a really good one, given that supporting the empire is supporting things that are hurtful to the Jewish people, why does Jesus say that, do you suppose? What thoughts do you have
At
about
some point in Jesus' youth, as I remember, there had been a Jewish revolt,
that?
and 2,000 Jews were crucified. I'm not sure if Jesus was downwind of that or not, as it happened, but he certainly would have known.
Sure.
And he may not have, like any good Jew, he may not have approved of Rome, but there was just no point in fighting the issue. So, my take has always been that he just went a giant step sideways, that Rome was irrelevant to God's kingdom, and that the fact that you're poor, the fact that you're hungry, the fact that, doesn't really matter if you're adopting his attitude.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's just put a pause there for a second and say, hi, Ellie.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm
Oh.
late. I lost track of time here.
That's quite all right. We're so glad to see you.
Well, you're not used to being on this time.
Exactly.
Well, there's that. Yeah, it's why isn't it 4:30 in the afternoon? I don't know.
Exactly. Happy hour. Okay, so let's keep going with that. So, the kingdom of the earth, the kingdom of this world, paying taxes is irrelevant to the kingdom of heaven. Jews had been crucified, horrific way of execution, which we know. So what do you think Jesus is suggesting? What's Jesus's intent, perhaps, in saying, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's?
Bow out. Don't participate in the rat race that, has been the Roman Empire.
Well, except that if he's saying pay taxes,
Yeah.
that is participating to some extent, right? Perhaps not actively, but certainly paying what is due.
Staying within the law.
Okay. The secular law. Good.
Yeah. Mm.
Okay. Well, I just want, going back to what Fred said, there is a very pragmatic aspect to that, right? Because it's dangerous to run afoul of the empire. And if you start rebelling and, not paying taxes, could be considered a form of rebellion, you might well find yourself on the wrong end of things. So I do think that there's a protective element to that word of wisdom, that advice, just do what you're supposed to do. But to Fred's point, don't engage beyond that.
Work to the rule.
Say more about that, Ellie.
Work to the rule. I think I can't remember what the term is, but since COVID, people have
Quiet quitting.
No, it's not exactly quiet quitting. There's a different, it's a similar but different thing, and that is only do what your job description covers, and for the rest of it, take care of yourself.
That's
this is
something
the
you can
same
understand.
Jesus who said, if a Roman soldier asks you to carry his pack 1 mile, you should carry it 2.
I don't remember that story, but that's not what this mentality, this new mentality, it's not that new a mentality, but covers. You carry it 1 mile and then you put it down gently and you walk away.
If trash day's on Friday, you take out your trash.
Yeah.
You comply with the law.
Don't go.
But don't go overboard.
Right.
Don't go
do
more.
more than
That's
you're
quiet
demanded.
quitting.
Right.
That's where you just, work to rule. The unions have when they don't want to strike, they will work exactly to the terms of their contract and not do anything more.
Mm-hmm.
And, quite often that is very, very disruptive to to an environment.
Teachers unions have done that, and it is extremely disruptive.
Yeah.
And a lot that should happen in the school doesn't happen when the
You don't grade
teachers work
papers
to
at
the rule.
home. You don't, buy extra supplies for your class.
Teaching is a career and a job environment that relies on doing more than you're assigned to. It's distinctive, not necessarily unique, but very distinctive in that regard. Being a minister is a whole lot more than the job description.
Yeah, go figure. Yeah.
Well, Well,
Yeah.
that's why they make so much money, Patty.
Exactly. That's, you've got to have the compensation somewhere.
Gotta
Yeah,
have
just like
those
teachers, yeah.
big bucks to make it worthwhile.
Exactly. So this is the passage I think you were referencing, Fred. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. I had to look it up. I couldn't remember exactly where it was. So Jesus, remember, this is Jesus's teaching from the Mount. So Matthew, so we know the Mount, Jesus is like Moses in that way. He says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. So do you hear this encounter in the temple as consistent with that, as divergent from that? What do you all think?
I think it's different in, sorry, Elin.
No,
It's
I'm just
different
saying
in that it's different in that you're dealing with legalities, and here you're dealing with your duty as a member of a community. And sorry, please go on, Elin.
No, I was just saying, to me, it's different. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's a whole different setup, a different teaching.
Okay.
Could we know what an evildoer is? Maybe what, oh, because, I mean, that's very concerning to me, not to resist an evildoer.
Good point.
Did you want me to look at the Greek?
If it's convenient, if
It's
you can.
convenient. We can certainly do that. Let me just get that out of the way. Okay, so that's Matthew 5. Okay.
Here we are.
All right. Do not resist an evil person. Poneros, full of labors, annoyances. We don't know anybody who's full of annoyances.
No.
Or just pressed and harassed by labors, or second definition, bad, of a bad nature or condition. And of course, understanding you at this time, you bring in the disease, physical manifestation that was considered to be some sort of reflection of inner brokenness. And then in the ethical sense, evil, wicked, or bad. So I don't know how, if that's helpful.
Well, if you know that the little girl next door is being abused by her father, you can't turn your back on that and just let it happen,
Mm-hmm.
which would go counter to this. So it might have some limited meaning that we don't really know what Jesus intended.
Hmm.
I mean, an annoying person is different from
Absolutely.
evil person.
Exactly. Exactly. So that brings us back to this question about paying taxes to Caesar. And then going from there, give therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And his audience feels kind of maybe trapped. Interestingly, this is a point, we've talked about some of the many ways that Jesus is turning things upside down during this section of Matthew, right? Once he comes into Jerusalem, he knows what's going to happen. I mean, it's sort of the end game. It's inevitable, right? Things have built up to this point. He's been predicting it, heaven knows. And so there's almost a more emboldened Jesus. We talked, Ellie talks about cranky Jesus, and here he's less cranky. He certainly was cranky when he turned over the tables. Here's less cranky and more, just out there, bold, gonna say it. So give give to God the things that are God's, what's Jesus doing there?
Is this a rebuke to the temple and the Pharisees who have accumulated earthly wealth?
Hmm.
Well, he's talking to the Pharisees, but I don't think he's directing his instruction to the Pharisees. He's just giving them this and to, smack them down. But for the general audience, I think he's maybe telling you to keep separate in your mind, or at least be aware of the difference in your mind between the things that God wishes for you to be righteous and in line with God, versus the nitty gritty of taking your garbage out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what is it that belongs to God? If you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give back to Caesar what's due to him, what is of his own, the coin of the realm. What is it that belongs to God?
Everything else that Jesus.
Everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, as I talked about on Sunday, but not everybody was there on Sunday. If it's the emperor's head that's on the coin, if it's the emperor's image that's on the coin, what's God's image on?
Us.
Us.
Creation.
Us, creation. So that's huge. It to your point, everything else. Give to God everything else. And of course they're amused by this, because one thing we kind of skipped over at the beginning of this paragraph is that it's not just the Pharisees he's talking to, it's also the Herodians. So he's got to, navigate, because if he says, no, it's not lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, that may make the Pharisees happy, but it's going to really tick off the Herodians. And vice versa, if he says, yeah, don't, just pay taxes, but without this bit about give to God what's God, that's going to upset the Jews. So he's got to figure this out. And
both of these groups had their own police force.
Mm-hmm. So he could
Probably
be in
trailing along,
big
just
trouble.
waiting.
Listen to whatever he was going to say, because of course by this point he's gotten a lot of attention, right? We know this certainly from his entry into Jerusalem. We know this before he came into Jerusalem because of all the crowds following him. But yeah, so it's like when certain people get up at a microphone and say stupid things, and the whole country is leaning in to say, oh, can you believe what he said today? It's the same kind of thing. It's like everybody's waiting to see what Jesus is going to say and pounce accordingly if needs be. So yeah, that's a good point.
It's just for a second. You probably covered this earlier, but who are the Herodians?
So the Herodians are of the party of Herod. So they are, the sycophants, I would say, of
the secular.
Yeah.
The secular enforcers for the Roman Empire.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. All right. So, and remember too, going back. Okay, let me do this. Going back to the end of 21, you remember Matthew says, after the whole the fig tree and the wicked tenants, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus's parables, they realized he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. So that's kind of the background for all of these encounters in the temple, right? Is that, again, the ante has been upped. So When they heard this, they were amazed and they left him and went away. But are they just, going off and saying, oh, well, he got us and resigning themselves? Or, are they still trying to
They're
figure
going to plot again. I think it's interesting that there's there's another question, but then you got to the greatest commandment
Mm-hmm.
part of Matthew, where he is sort of more or less answering,
Hold
how
that
what your priorities should be.
Yep, hold that thought because we're getting there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, why don't we move on to this next section, the question about the resurrection. Another, sorry, having trouble getting things so I can see them. Another challenge to Jesus. Would someone like to read these two paragraphs for us? 23 through 33.
I can
Okay.
do it. Go ahead, Ellie.
All right, you do next. The same day, some Sadducees came to him, saying there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question. Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, and so also the third, down to the 7th. Poor woman. Last of all, the woman herself died of sheer boredom. In the resurrection, then, sorry.
Yeah.
In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her. Jesus answered them, you're wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowds heard it, they were astounded at his teaching.
Okay. So now it's the crowds who are astounded. Before we get into the details of this, because I find this just a really interesting passage, let's just look at that word astounded. We gotta go back to Matthew 22. They were, and this says astonished. Ekplaso, strike out, expel by a blow, drive out, cast off, driven out, struck with amazement, astonished. You get the sense that this is kind of bowled over, right? That there's this physical connotation to their astonishment. Okay, so what's going on here?
Why would the Sadducees be asking this question?
Because they didn't believe in resurrection.
Yeah, so for them, this is a non-issue.
Right, but for Jesus,
they're challenging him, saying, okay, well, we don't believe there's a resurrection because, given your resurrection, which person is going to be the husband of this poor woman?
Haven't you thought about this? I've thought about this question a lot because Mormon people have this thing, like when they get married, like their fate is sealed in heaven together. But, widows and widowers remarry. And I've often thought, oh, maybe they're like polygamists in heaven. I mean, what happens? Like, how does it all work? And even here, like when you think about somebody who loses their husband and they always think, oh, I want to be reunited with him in heaven, and then they remarry somebody else. How does it all work? This question is like one on my mind. So I don't know why. I get why somebody would ask the question. Like, if you believe in forever and an afterlife, how does it all work that way?
Let me
And if you don't believe
what they think about this one.
I went through the Mormon temple when it was open the last time,
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
and there was a very senior, we were getting somebody very senior in the Mormon church, apparently. I forget what he wasn't a prophet, but he was, and he went through this whole spiel of how you're married and when you die, you're with your wife and your children forever. And I just kept thinking, well, then, your wife is with her parents forever and her brothers and sisters and her family, and they're with their family. And it just got to be I don't know if anybody remembers Barrel of Monkeys, where they had these monkeys with the long tails and you were supposed to make a
Mhm.
Yeah.
long chain.
Yeah.
But it just seemed to me that, if you follow this to its logical conclusion, all of humanity is in one big ball,
Mhm.
because, you
Well,
can't, everybody is connected to somebody else who's connected to 6 other people
mhm.
and it didn't shake, it didn't cause me to question my Episcopalianness, because it just didn't seem practical.
Okay. So going back to Christianity,
You mean, okay, exclude the Mormon church.
well, there are many of us who would say that Mormonism isn't necessarily Christian. That's why I say that. What is Jesus saying here? So we understand. So the poor Sadducees, they're always described as the ones who don't believe in the resurrection. That's about all we know about them, right? That and the fact that they are elite. So they challenged Jesus and said, okay, you believe in this resurrection business. Explain how this works, and they're probably thinking, we finally got him. The Pharisees and Herodians didn't get him, but now it's our turn. We'll give it a try. And so Jesus is like, you are wrong. When do you ever hear Jesus say you are wrong? That got my attention. I heard that loud and clear this time.
Mhm.
Neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven.
But would you believe this? Like, I, does it make sense? I mean, were they astounded that he said you're wrong and these are such religious, maybe elders or something? Were they astounded by that, or were they astounded by this information? Because I feel like if I met some guy on the street and he said this to me, it wouldn't carry a lot of, you know what I mean? It's
Well, a
so
couple of things.
abstract.
To answer your question, a couple of things. First of all, it's not the Sadducees who are astounded. It's the crowds who are astounded.
Okay.
And second of all, it's not just some guy in the street. This is Jesus. And they are very pointedly asking him this question. So let's go back to Jesus's response. What is Jesus saying here? In the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's God not of the dead, but of the living. What does that, how do we get he is God not of the dead, but of the living from I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What is Jesus saying there? I think it's worth parsing out. What does that mean?
But they are still alive.
Well, maybe. Yep.
That's what I would take from it.
Mm-hmm.
That they have, as it were, they have moved on, but that doesn't mean they're dead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which would be perhaps an astonishing concept for some of the crowds to try to get their heads around.
No, not at all. Back then, the world was full of ghosts and spirits, and
But they're astonished. So why are they astonished? Why are they astounded? Why are they bowled over by this?
I'm less astounded than baffled.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Okay. So why
Yeah.
are
And that's why I wonder why they don't have the same reaction. Wouldn't they be baffled? You know, wouldn't they be?
okay, let's go back to Ellie and Elin. Why are you baffled? Let's pull that out. What's baffling?
You go. I'm still trying to parse it.
Yeah. It sort of contradicts my belief system in a way, you know.
How so?
You're dead, you're dead. If you're going to heaven, you're not on earth.
Right?
I am the God of Abram, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God, not of the dead, but of the living and the crowded. Now, I find it very difficult to follow. Let me just see what Amy Jo Levine says.
Well, while you're doing that, let's think back to what Fred was saying about, maybe we need to rethink our
Oh,
life.
wait a minute. Sorry. Can I just intersperse this bit that she says firstly, and then I think that it helps me, may not. The Sadducees attempt to point out the ridiculousness of bodily resurrection. So go back a bit. Okay. Sorry to
That's
interrupt.
okay.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
And so remember too, who was it that taught bodily resurrection and preached bodily resurrection?
Oh, heck.
Hmm.
All the early Christians.
Specifically?
Catholics.
Mary Magdalene, Peter, the 12
Specifically.
apostles.
Who preached, wrote about bodily resurrection that we've read, that we know?
Hmm.
You mean
Paul?
before?
Paul. And so bear in mind that Paul was writing way before Matthew. So the epistles of Paul, and Paul talking, remember, First Thessalonians is the first epistle, the earliest epistle in the New Testament. Probably the earliest Christian writing that gets canonized into the Bible. And so Paul talks about bodily resurrection. And Matthew's writing way after Paul. So it could be that there's some critique here of that. Going back to what Elin and Amy Jo Levine were saying, there could be some critique of that theology that resurrected bodily. Could be. But what I started to say earlier was going back to what you said, Fred, about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Maybe we need to rethink what living means, right? If Jesus says, I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly in John's gospel, I realize, not Matthew, but we talk all about new life, new creation, this idea of something new being born, right? That this is a moment of thinking, that the fathers, the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're that triumvirate, I can never say that word, is always invoked, right? That they are not just, one and done. They're not just gone. That what is this new life into which Jesus is inviting us? I mean, I think that's, to me, that is worth being astounded at, because that's like causing us to rethink time, life, death, what happens after we die.
Well,
how many,
maybe dead means the people who are not afforded the afterlife. Like that there's like a distinction between dead and not receiving afterlife or heaven, or whatever,
Not
and
resurrected
then
into the
not
afterlife.
resurrected. And then the rest are considered living. They're resurrected, they're with God, they're,
How bad do you have to be not resurrected?
right?
I think the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are, to the Jews, fundamentally still alive because they're still present. Their writings, their teachings, their experience, their lives are still very real and very pertinent. And so therefore I can see that the distinction of he's the God of these figures that are
Okay.
still very important to life. But the line, he's God not of the dead, but of the living. If you don't happen to be a biblical prophet, does God abandon you? What happens to them? I mean, not so much
It's the same.
you don't get resurrected, but are you forgotten? Or why is God leaving out the people who are not so important?
Is that what he's saying though?
Not of the dead, but of the living. But so you just have to believe that when you're dead, you're not dead.
Yeah, I like Kim's version of that.
But think about what we profess to believe, and think about, when Jesus says, you know, neither the scriptures nor the power of God. I think that is an interpretive clue for us. Jesus is talking about, is reframing God's power. How do we limit God if we say, well, God's not the God of the people who have died, God. Jesus is saying, rethink what life and death are. So, I think this question of, well, has God abandoned? I think that's exactly the opposite of what Jesus is saying, actually. He's God not of the dead, but of the living. Now, if God is God of all, and we just said a paragraph ago that render to God what belongs to God, and we just said everything belongs to God, then are we not putting God in a box if we are deciding, who belongs to God and who doesn't? What about this question, in the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage? What does that suggest to you?
That implies to me that no, you're not actually yourself walking around in a white robe with a circle on your head. That you do become, that you could become a spirit within God, and you are yourself. You're not anything that belongs to anything else or specifically connected to anything else. I think it's you and him.
I think that Jesus was put out by that ridiculous question. And he
This is the cranky
his
Jesus again.
the cranky one, yeah.
He's a
I
little
think
impatient
that
here.
he is, when he says you're wrong, that shows how irritated he is, and that his point is that you can't think in literal terms about big ideas like God and an afterlife, and you can't equate, who marries whom here on earth with what's going to happen on another plane altogether. And I don't think when he says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, I mean, that I don't think he's repudiating them or saying they're dead and gone. I think it's all in a living line. They're all the living God. And Jesus is in this line of people who are truly godly. And, you're not gonna be able to apply your earthly logic to this.
Preach it. That was beautiful,
Exactly.
Donna. Well done. I
I have a theory. I have a theory on this.
Can I finish
Oh,
what
sure.
I'm starting to say?
Yeah.
Thank you. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Elon, the God of Donna, the God of Jackie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this line, there's no demarcation. And so when Jesus says, you do not understand the power of God, we think in these limited temporal, linear ways, and God explodes all that. Go ahead, Kim.
Well, I was just going to say, and maybe this is thinking more literally and less figuratively, but I feel like God is the creator. So the purpose of marriage, if you look at it in a Catholic sense, would be procreation. And that's not our task in heaven, right? Because God really creates and maybe creates through us on earth, but then once we're all up there, I don't know, I guess I don't feel like we need to have that role anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You are
That's simplifying.
reincarnated, physically with a body that, wants to eat, presumably needs to breathe.
Is that a question or a statement, Fred?
Well, I don't think anybody can make the statement, but Christian orthodoxy is your body is reincarnated. Jesus ate.
No, it's resurrected. We've talked about that before. The reincarnation is going into a different body.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
resurrection, breathe life into again.
So but you still have a body that apparently has normal, physical desires and needs.
Well, that's what Paul would say. Paul would say that it's the physical resurrection of the body.
But Paul didn't want you to get married anyway.
Well, okay, but
Where did he get that idea anyway?
From Paul. He says
he
it's
said,
better.
don't get married.
He says it's better not to marry, but it's better to marry than to burn with lust.
Well, yeah, no, what I mean is, where did Paul get the idea of physical resurrection?
Right. And it may be from his ecstatic experience of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. Perhaps from that he extrapolates that everybody's body is resurrected physically. Of course, that's one of the theological issues that has plagued people for generations, certainly in the Roman Catholic Church, around nation. Right? Because if the body is destroyed, how can it be resurrected physically? And the Catholic Church has begun to shift on that. Certainly the Episcopal Church has as well. But so those are some of the questions. What does that look like? And maybe it is a bodily resurrection because we don't know the power of God, right? We have a very limited understanding.
He created us out of dust to begin with, so
and going right, exactly. Look what God can do with dust. So it doesn't, just because we can't fathom it doesn't mean that God can't do it. And that's exactly what Donna was saying. So I don't know the answer to that. But Paul is a big proponent of the bodily resurrection. Scripture contradicts itself. So, we don't necessarily, none of us, I don't think, knows.
Well, as I've said before, that's what separated Christianity from many other religions of the time, which, the ancient world was filled with spirits.
Right.
Ghosts and spirits and things with non-corporeal, essence were just surrounded everybody. So what separated Christianity from them was this idea of corporal resurrection.
Well, that's not the only thing that separated Christianity.
No, but that was a big selling point.
Jesus is a big separation between Christianity and other religions in terms of understanding Jesus as God incarnate, God taking on human flesh.
That was not a given in the early church. The early church debated, what was the Messiah the same as being the Son of God? Was being the Son of God the same as being God?
Right.
So, at the time of Paul and Matthew, those issues would not have been settled.
Well, by Matthew, because, and think about John. John is very clear.
John was written to be theology.
I understand that. All right, let's go back to this so we can finish this up. So to this question about in the resurrection, to Kim's point, maybe we don't need to be married. if, what is the purpose of marriage, Christian marriage? Now, Kim said children. Uh, That's not the only purpose of Christian marriage. What else? I do this when I'm counseling couples for marriage. What are other purposes of marriage?
It's
For
just a
mutual
bond.
support.
Mutual
Find a
support.
life partner.
Okay, partnership, support. And that's meant to be an exclusive relationship, which is why I wanted to cordon the Mormons off over here. And in the resurrection, that exclusivity, from what Jesus says, isn't necessary. And maybe going back to your barrel of monkeys image, which I just loved, Fred, because I got the visual right away. I remember my barrel of monkeys, the red and the blue, and the tails connected. If we think about this connectedness, then that exclusivity and that need for support, partnership, it might be irrelevant. It might not be needed. I kind of like that idea myself. I love my husband. I love being married. And I love the notion that it's not necessary, because it's the kingdom of heaven is not like the kingdom on earth. That's one of the things I find hopeful about what Jesus says. And he also smacks down the Sadducees. There he goes again. So yeah, talk about cranky Jesus. You are wrong. Again, when ever say you are wrong, right? Right, boldly says that. So
They're nitpicking.
yeah, totally.
So,
How many
they don't
angels can dance
deserve.
on the edge of on the head of a pin, right?
And
Yeah,
I know what you're up to. This is a stupid question. And
yeah. Thank you.
Donna, you've been trying to say something.
Well, yes. I mean, it just occurred to me that with this question, which is so ridiculous, that when Ellie read it, she was making fun of it, and we're all laughing at it. Did they really think that Jesus was going to kind of scratch his beard and say, "Ooh, I don't know"? Oh my goodness. I
we
mean,
hadn't worked that out yet.
yeah, I mean, it's so absurd to. I mean, they were underestimating him so much.
That's exactly what I was just thinking as you were speaking, Donna, that they didn't realize who they were dealing with. I love
Jesus had already demolished the first and second teams. They were sending in the farm team at this point.
They did not do so well. I love it. It's like exactly. It's just knocking down string after string after string. Really. And
Speaking of, was anybody else upset at the lesson on Sunday, or find it, a little silly, where the Jews are giving their God, credit for Cyrus?
Where are you?
Yeah, I'm
The lesson on Sunday.
the Isaiah,
where Cyrus, it was from Isaiah, where he's saying, that God, told, made Cyrus, and even though Cyrus didn't know who was doing it, now Cyrus was, responsible for allowing the Jews to return to their homeland. So I can see why. But instead of just saying thank you, or, they are saying God moved Cyrus to do this without Cyrus knowing it.
well, I think the point was that Cyrus wasn't Jewish.
Yeah.
He's Persian. So I think that was the point, that it reminds me of Paul Tillich talking about anonymous Christians, right? That some people act in a certain way, even though they don't have the relationship with God. I think that's what the prophet is saying there. I'm looking at the clock. It's 11:35. Do we want to talk about the greatest commandment? I think we'll wait for the question about David's son for 2 weeks, because that'll take us a long time just to parse out. Jesus is almost impossible to understand in that part. Do we want to talk about the greatest commandment now, or do we want to hold off and do both of these sections in 2 weeks when we regroup?
We can talk about it now if everybody's available.
Let's do it in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks.
I mean, we can glance it over now and think about it and then talk about it next week or next time.
Mhm.
All right, why don't we read it and then get whatever immediate reactions people have, and then we'll pick up there on the 8th. That sounds like a good compromise. Okay, would someone like to read? Kim, I think you were up to read this paragraph.
Okay. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and all the prophets.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, I think it's good that we're at least hearing this in the context of what we've just heard, right? The coin and then the ridiculous resurrection and marriage question. So now the Pharisees are hearing that he smacked them down. So, okay. So they're regrouping. And so now they ask another question to test him. And we get what is known as the summary of the law. Any quick responses to this before we quit?
How strong a rebuke would this be to the Pharisees who, their whole raison d'etre is to follow the law as closely as possible?
Right. Do we think this is a rebuke?
I don't
They're
know.
trying to test him. How do we hear his response?
I think he's saying if your heart is there to do what's right, all the rest just falls into place. Like you're not going to steal from somebody, and you're not going to have sex with your neighbor's wife. If the love is there and the heart is there, the rest is pretty easy. It just falls into place.
The behavior follows the
The
sentiment.
behavior follows the heart or whatever. So.
Exactly. I kind of wonder sometimes whether they're trying, whether the question is just, we're going to stump Jesus, or an actual sincere question. I mean, we've got all these laws and prophets and whatnot. What's the principle behind all of this? They're certainly walking into giving him the opportunity to say this primary principle.
I mean, yeah, when you think about it, if somebody said to you, what's the worst thing you could do to someone? Someone might say, oh, murder someone, right? Not go to church, or not love your neighbor, right? Like when we think about the worst things that we can acts that we can commit against people, it's not loving them. It's not the absence of love. It's like this hatred,
Well,
so
it's
it
the
is a different.
Pharisees.
Love it, their donkey.
Yeah.
The Pharisees' whole position of strength was that they were following the law of God.
But which law? There's 613.
What was the trap? Well, I guess the question I have is, what was the trap here?
Well, I guess the trap is there's 613. How are you going to privilege one over the rest? And maybe that's, I don't know if it's a trap to catch him out in heresy or blasphemy, or if they just thought, well, this is impossible because there are so many, and how's he going to pick one? It's a good question. And notice they're not astounded or amazed or scratching their heads after that. I mean, maybe to Ellie's point, maybe there is an element of sincerity in that. We don't know, because we can't hear tone. It's like reading an email. We can't hear tone. I kind of would like to think that maybe there is some desire to learn from Jesus. I'm not sure about that, but I like the idea of it.
The one who asked it said was an expert in the law.
Yeah.
So maybe he, it's a sincere effort to trick Jesus, because this guy was an expert and he knew what he thought.
Yeah. Oh, you think you're so smart. I'm the expert. So
Oh.
maybe. Well, why
Maybe he's the Aristotelian expert who knows that he doesn't know everything.
Well, why don't we pick up in that spot on November 8th? I can hear the presiding bishop as we read this, because that's Michael Curry's theology and preaching in a nutshell. And so let's pick up there. Again, we won't meet next Wednesday. Come to church, and then, if we have time to grab coffee or lunch afterwards, that would be great. And then we'll gather again on the 8th. This was wonderful, as always. Thank you all.
Thank
you.
you.
Patty.
Thank you,
Patty.
Patty.
And
Thanks, Patty.
some of you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.